Welcome to our Curious Amalgam, the weekly podcast brought to you by the Antitrust Law section of the American Bar Association. Our Curious Amalgam explores the fascinating and increasingly overlapping world of competition, consumer protection, data protection, and privacy law. Each week, we bring you leading global experts on the most compelling issues of the day. Enjoy the show.
Hi, and welcome to our Curious Amalgam, the podcast from the American Bar Association Antitrust Law section. My name is Jon Roberti, and today's program is What's the Plan? A conversation with Antitrust Law Section Chair Jonathan Gleklen and Counsel to the Chair Yasmine Harik. Each year in the Antitrust Law section, there is a peaceful transfer of power. A new person takes over as the Antitrust Law Chair. One of the nice things about the section, though, is it's a very well-planned transition of power. And so the person who takes over actually has been in a position knowing they're going to take over for 2 years. So a lot of planning and thinking goes into what the section chair is going to do with his or her year. And so today we are going to have a conversation with the new Antitrust Law Section Chair and his counsel to see what, if anything, they are planning. My co-host today is Alicia Downey. Hey, Alicia.
Hi, John.
All right, Alicia, we're talking to the section chair today. What's going to happen?
Well, first, let me introduce them to everybody. With us today is Jon Gleklen, who is the new section chair. He's a partner in the Washington, D.C. office of Arnold & Porter and chair of the firm's U.S. Antitrust Practice Group. Jon has been actively involved in the leadership of the Antitrust Law section for more than 20 years, and a lot of that was focused on contributing to the section's periodicals and treatises as both an author and editor. He and his wife, Amy, have 4 grown children. Welcome to the program, Jon.
Thanks, Alicia. And thanks, Jon.
Also with us today is Jon's counsel. It's an official position in the section, the counsel to the chair, Yasmine Harik. And Yasmine is an associate in the Washington, D.C. office of Arnold & Porter. But before she joined the firm, she was a senior writer for Global Competition Review based in Washington, D.C. and London. Welcome to the show, Yasmine.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Great. Well, with both of you here, let me kick this off with a question first to Jon, which I know everybody wants to hear. What are your goals for this year as the chair?
Look, I recognize that I stand on the shoulders of giants. This section has been phenomenally successful for the last 20 years, even more than that, and I'd like very much not to screw it up. I'd also very much like there not to be a global pandemic so we can get back to normal and have our in-person programming. In terms of specific plans for the section, we're moving forward with plans to make the section a better home for people who do antitrust and consumer protection. And more broadly, we want the section to do its own small part to make the world a better place. So, for example, just to talk about the last thing first, we have 2 new initiatives. First, we have a task force that is looking at antitrust, consumer protection, and diverse consumers. So how can antitrust and consumer protection institutions better serve members of minority communities and immigrants, women, the LGBTQ community? That task force is led by Leslie Overton and Eileen Carr. I started this because I was talking to a law school professor of mine who said, Jon, the greatest return on investment would be to improve the services offered to Native American communities who are the biggest victims of scams. So that's what this task force is going to do, is what are the ways in which antitrust and consumer protection institutions can better serve people who really need the help. One way to have antitrust and consumer protection better serve diverse communities is to have more diverse lawyers practicing antitrust and consumer protection. And we already have a bunch of programs to encourage law students to practice antitrust and CP. So we have the Steiger Fellowship that puts law students with state AG offices to work on consumer protection issues. We have a new program with law school scholarships funded by the section specifically for diverse attorneys. But to talk like an antitrust lawyer for a minute, one of the things we want to do is lower the barriers to entry to the profession. The cost of a casebook is a barrier to taking antitrust for students in law school. there's a big movement on law school campuses to have what are called open source antitrust casebooks. They're free. They're under an open source copyright license like open source software is. And a law student who's facing a choice between paying $300 or $350 for an antitrust casebook and a copyright casebook that's free may end up choosing to take copyright because the book is free. So I asked my friend, law school classmate, Chris Prigman, who's now at NYU, who did an open source copyright casebook, and Daniel Francis, who's now at Harvard, to lead up an initiative to create an open source antitrust casebook. And I'm really excited about it. And I'm not the only one. When I talked to Macon Delrahim, who ran the antitrust division in the last administration, about what he'd like to do to get back involved in the section, and I described the opportunities, this was the thing he was most excited about. He thinks this is really important. And I agree that we need to make it easier to become an antitrust lawyer. And one of the ways to do that is to have a casebook that's free. In terms of improving the section, I'm very excited about our diversity efforts. Building on the work over the last couple of years, we have a new committee that is focused solely on the section's diversity efforts. We have a new, for the first time, diversity officer, Fiona Schaefer, who is the section's vice chair, serves as the diversity officer. And we're working on a brand new diversity plan for the section, which hasn't been updated in, I think, a decade. We're also working on ways to make the section a better home for young lawyers. Building on my long-range planning project when I was a vice chair, we have a new task force focused on, as I said, ways to make the section a better home for young lawyers. So those are my priorities, but mostly it's not to screw things up.
Yeah, John, can I go back to the very first one you mentioned, which is the diversity, or trying to get antitrust and consumer protection to diverse communities? It's a very hot topic. I mean, I think we've talked about the OECD effort in that space. What do you imagine the task force producing that's going to help in that effort?
So they'll do what task forces usually do, which is write a report, and then the recommendations of that report. I don't know what the recommendations will be. I can imagine there are some things that seem obvious, right? So if you want to protect diverse consumers, you need people who speak the languages spoken by diverse consumers. So maybe what we need is to hire more people with Spanish language skills or Vietnamese language skills or whatever. So those are, I think, the easy things, and to increase, recruiting at law schools. There are countries like South Africa that expressly include in their competition law the effect on diverse communities and employment in minority communities. I guess I would be surprised if that's where the task force ended up as a recommendation, but they're going to look at everything from the kind of obvious questions, obvious solutions like investing more, to do there need to be changes in the law?
And now, do the task forces that you are putting together consist of people who come at antitrust and consumer protection from lots of different angles, or are they maybe more homogenous in their thinking? How would you describe the makeup of these task forces?
So in all of our leadership appointments, Yasmine and I have looked to have diversity of, racial and gender and ethnic diversity, and importantly, diversity of viewpoint. So we have people who are on the plaintiff side of things. We have people who are in the defense bar. We have people who are in the government, and we have people who defend things by the government. We are limited by people who are already involved in the section. So I think there's probably a bias towards a more traditional approach to antitrust and consumer protection thinking, because those are the people who tend to be members of the antitrust section. But I am pretty confident that we have a diversity of viewpoints and people who will be open to very, different ways of approaching these issues. And this, the same thing on the casebook too, right? We have somebody from the American Antitrust Institute, and we have, I don't know that anybody would actually say Macon Delrahim is very conservative, but we have people who are from the Trump administration, and we have people from AAI and people from state AG offices. It's a diverse group.
And as you look forward to the coming year, I know we were pretty much on Zoom with respect to the major conferences, and there was very little travel going on. But what are you looking forward to if we are, in fact, going to get past the pandemic?
I really miss the opportunity for in-person interaction. The people who have done the spring meeting virtually for the last 2 years and the fall forum virtually have done an amazing job. But there's just a difference between Zoom and being in a room, with 3,500 people at the spring meeting. So, I'm very excited about the fall forum, which is coming up on November 9th in DC, focusing on antitrust in the new administration. That will be in person. There will be a reception the night before from our Women Connected group. And then we've got the spring meeting in April 5th to 8th. And again, there's just no substitute for having 3,500 people from around the world in one building talking about antitrust and consumer protection and data privacy issues, and with a drink, alcoholic or not, in your hand and hors d'oeuvres. It's a way of seeing old friends and making new friends. And you just can't do that as well on Zoom.
I think that's all right, John. Although I think part of learning was there are things that the virtual stuff does bring and some benefits. Do you anticipate doing any of the conferences either this year or in the future having virtual elements to them?
So I think there will be some virtual elements and there will be some social virtual elements. So, one of the things you mentioned, is the new things that the virtual environment allowed. But we had lots of foreign participants, associates at law firms in Brazil or Mexico, where it was hard for their firms to justify the expense of sending somebody to Washington, but they could participate virtually. We do want in-person conferences. It is expensive and complicated to simulcast virtually, but we definitely will have more virtual aspects to lots of our programming. And, the committee programming has completely changed from doing telephone to Zoom and seeing people. And I think that is a good way of bringing in people who can't be in the room.
Yeah, John, I think that's right, because I think it's super hard to network over Zoom. The technology isn't great for that. And that's what we really, I think, have missed being in person. In addition, that there's, as you just said before, just different being in person. But there are people, I think you do increase the accessibility. So I'm delighted to hear that we're looking at doing both and trying to get the best of, down the road, at least get the best of both worlds.
Now, for some people who might not know this, climbing the ladder to the position of the chair of the section is a years-long process. There are various positions leading up to it, including vice chair, chair-elect. So looking back, at the time you began to climb the ladder, John, did you ever predict that antitrust, of all things, would be such a hot topic during the year that you're the chair, with headlines every day? What do you think are the most important stories to keep an eye on?
Antitrust has been hot for, 25 years, but it has not been this hot, right? I've got my kids who are actually interested in my job, which is, a new experience for me. So no, I don't think anybody could plausibly have claimed to think that antitrust was going to be this hot, and particularly in a Biden administration, right? This is not a Sanders or a Warren administration, but the Biden administration is putting a big emphasis on it. Where is it going to go? I don't know what, the headlines haven't been written yet, where we just have a new nominee, not yet confirmed in the antitrust division, and a brand new FTC chair in Lena Khan. And, we know that the administration thinks it's important. We know that Chair Khan thinks this is important, but there's certainly talk about taking antitrust in new directions beyond the traditional approaches that both Democratic and Republican administrations for the last 30 years have pursued. But what exactly that will mean, are we really looking at new theories of harm or new standards or new mechanisms of enforcement? And that remains to be seen. And of course, what the courts have to say about all of that remains to be seen as well. But nobody could have imagined that I would be the chair of the section. First of all, nobody could have imagined I would ever be chair of the section, but certainly nobody could have ever imagined that it would be at this time of, this intellectual ferment, this excitement, this, way in which antitrust is, part of the popular imagination and the popular conversation.
Given your position and given the number of years in which you've been a practitioner, particularly based in Washington, D.C., you know a lot of people in the antitrust and consumer protection community. not just in DC, but within the United States and even all over the world. And you're about to meet just about everybody else. What do you think is the best thing about the Antitrust and Consumer Protection Bar?
So, it is a great group of people who care about antitrust and care about consumer protection. And, people have very different views about, what the right results are. But the question we're asking in antitrust and consumer protection, is this good for consumers or bad for consumers? And there are different ways of deciding whether conduct is good for consumers or bad for consumers. But you have a bunch of people who are really excited and interested in talking about, is this something that will make the world a better place? So that's great. These are people who care about things that actually impact people and impact people's lives. And people are, in and out of government. There's the plaintiff's bar. There are people who spent their whole careers in government. And we disagree about what the right answers are on particular cases. But it is great that we all care about the issue and we all talk to each other. One of the great successes of the antitrust section is being the one place in the world, not just for U.S. antitrust lawyers, but for competition lawyers and consumer protection practitioners around the world to come together and talk about these issues. I don't know how many antitrust lawyers there are in the world, but if you get 3,500 of them at our spring meeting, that is a huge portion of them. So the fact that we all work together and talk together and debate these issues together, it's a great way of practicing law, to be around people who care about this stuff and to come together and, hash stuff out and argue about it and write articles and have other people write responses. That's, it's just a fun way of practicing law.
Now, you talked a little bit at the top of the program about the initiatives that you're taking to diversify the profession, recruit law students of different backgrounds to look at antitrust and consumer protection careers. Is there anything else about the antitrust and consumer protection community that you'd like to see change?
So I think the most important thing is diversification. It's not just a bunch of white guys, but there are a lot of white guys who do antitrust. I think the antitrust bar has been more successful at getting women involved. The legal profession is not particularly diverse, and the antitrust bar is less diverse than the legal profession as a whole. It definitely needs to be more diverse. It needs to be geographically more diverse. The bar is very focused in New York and DC, with some in Chicago and LA and San Francisco, and obviously people around the world in Brussels and London and places like that. But I'd like to see it be more geographically diverse. And we need to be welcoming to people of diverse viewpoints. People have to not just be writing a law review article and sitting in their classroom teaching. We want them to feel like they can engage with people in the section. And people have been making an effort to bring in the plaintiff's bar to the section, but it has to be a place that welcomes and debates with people no matter what their perspective, whether it's a traditional approach to antitrust enforcement or new views. And let's debate them honestly and forthrightly and kind of let the best ideas win.
Great. So an open door policy. Turning to Yasmine, tell us a little bit, what is the role of the counsel to the chair?
I like to describe the position to folks who are unfamiliar with the section as sort of a chief of staff type of role. I think for the most part, I'm there to support Jon, to give some feedback on the various ideas that he has been talking about, to participate in meetings, to push those initiatives forward. With respect to programming, to be involved on the day of, to the extent necessary, and, kind of to pretty much do whatever Jon asks of me, and whatever the staff and the section needs to be done, I'm up for it.
Now, I assume you've worked together before. Do you consider Jon to be a mentor?
Yes, definitely. In fact, Jon was the person who encouraged me to get involved in the section. It was shortly after I arrived at Arnold & Porter. And he came into my office and, gave me a little speech about the section and its benefits and, how it would be helpful to me in my career going forward. And I took his advice and applied to be a young lawyer representative. And it's been 5 or 6 years now in the section, and he was right. So,
Okay, Yasmine, I just want to push back on that a little bit because John gave you a little speech and said, "Oh, join the section." Did that little speech come with, "Oh, and by the way, can you do this thing? Can you write this article for me? Because you should totally join the section and write my article." Is that kind of how it went?
Well, my memory's a little fuzzy, but that's entirely possible. Frankly, John, I think I was so pleased to be at Arnold and Porter, but I was also very earnest, to be honest. And what folks were suggesting that I do, I was on board. I certainly wasn't in a position to say, no, I don't think that's a good idea. So I took his advice and also perhaps helped him with some articles.
Yeah, well, I still remember, 1,000 years ago when I first got involved in the section, I was flattered into doing it. Somebody said, "Oh, you would be a great choice to edit this book." And for the next 2 years, I edited that book, but it was actually very rewarding. So what are you most looking forward to in the coming year?
I would echo what John has said about getting back to in-person events. I think for young lawyers in particular, attending in-person events, in particular the spring meeting, is really valuable, especially if you're willing to kind of go outside of your comfort zone and speak to people who have been doing this for so many years. They have valuable insights. They have career advice. Sometimes they're also even enjoyable to just talk to about non-antitrust things. So I think that's a huge advantage to make those connections. I have developed relationships and mentorships with people outside of Arnold and Porter, and that's due largely in part to my participation in the section and having had the chance to actually meet them. I mean, Zoom, of course, was a great stand-in, but as John said, we're really excited to get back to in-person events.
So, Yasmine, before you, in your prior career, I understand that you were a writer for Global Competition Review.
Yes.
Who were some of your best sources for Global Competition Review?
I think I will not reveal that information. But I had to learn who was who, so to speak, in the bar and understand, which firms, were working on which matters. And I jumped into that role without really any of that context or understanding. And so it took some time to figure out, who would be willing to speak a little bit more freely, who would often say, no, I'm no comment, repeatedly, no comment, which is understandable. And I think the folks who enjoyed speaking the most oftentimes were people in an academic setting, right? They don't really have any sort of, there's no need to not offend a client or speak out of turn, or, they're a little bit more liberated, so to speak, in how they can approach certain topics. But virtually, everyone in the bar is willing to provide something at some point or another, and I think it was a nice way to get into journalism. I'm not sure had I worked, elsewhere in the journalism field, if people would have been so forthcoming.
Now, Jon and Yasmine, in preparing this episode, I realized you both had something in common, which is your writing background. Yasmine, with your experience at GCR, Jon, with your years of experience working on the periodicals and even the big treatises that the section produces. So I wanted to ask each of you, first of all, do you enjoy writing about antitrust topics? And if so, why? Let me start with Yasmine.
Yeah, I do, and I really came to love it. When I was at GCR, I think what's interesting and enjoyable about writing on antitrust topics and developments is that it's somewhat, to a certain degree, it's a little bit intuitive. These are concepts that people can, at least at a basic level, pick up pretty quickly. You can tell what's good for consumers versus what's really bad. And there's some economics involved, there's some business involved, and it's not an area that's too jargony. It's not too it's not too academic or professorial. I mean, you can write a good story about an antitrust development or a case or a merger that's compelling without putting people to sleep, which sometimes can be the case when you're writing about the law or a case. It doesn't speak necessarily to non-lawyers all the time. But I think antitrust and consumer protection are unique in those respects. They have a practical, real life angle to them, and they make sense.
And Jon, in your answer, tell us, how did you find the time?
Well, it probably came out of time with family, the 4 kids and my wife. But the nice thing about doing writing is you can fit it in, right? Usually unlike the journalism that Yasmine did, when you're writing an article for Antitrust magazine or editing an article for Antitrust Law Journal, or other than the antitrust law developments needing to come out, 3 years from now, you can fit it in. And you can work it around your schedule. And if it happens between 10 p.m. and midnight after the kids have gone to bed, that's when you do it. Look, still do love writing about antitrust. And one of the neat things about antitrust is that it is an area where practitioners are active scholars. If you look at the articles about antitrust that get cited, sure, some of them are written by professors at Harvard or Yale or Chicago, but some of them are written by people who are practicing at Wilson Sonsini or whatever. There is a lot of intellectual debate in the antitrust bar, and people kind of call out each other, and it's what passes for fun in the antitrust bar is arguing about market definition or arguing about how intellectual property laws should interact with the antitrust laws.
So, Jon, I'm just going to take a slight issue with there. I think we do other things that pass for fun in the antitrust bar besides arguing about market definition. I've seen it, and for many people, that is right. I also want to ask you a question, a true or false question. True or false? In your office at Arnold & Porter, you have a recycling bin that has a giant replica of Antitrust Law Development's 7th edition.
Well, it's actually not a recycling bin. When Antitrust Law Development 7th edition came out, and I was the editorial chair, for reasons I don't really understand, we hired a mime to walk around the spring meeting to promote the book wearing an Antitrust Law Development's costume. And the big box is the box that the mime wore, that is the Antitrust Law Development's book. So we haze new associates by making them wear the Antitrust Law Development's costume.
Okay, well then let's shift gears. With that, Yasmine, let's start with you. Tell us something interesting about yourself that we wouldn't know if we only knew you professionally.
I have developed a recent obsession, due in large part to the pandemic, with traveling in an RV and camping, RV camping. I never thought I would enjoy that, or I would be someone who does that. I grew up in suburban New York City, and if I wanted to get somewhere, I typically took a plane or drove a car. And when those options weren't looking too great during the pandemic, my husband and I, on a whim, decided to rent an RV. And we've done it a few times even since then, and it's so fun. I mean, it is incredibly liberating and fun and ridiculous sometimes, especially our first trip when we had no idea what we were doing. But man, I mean, you can decide your day, your schedule, when all of your belongings in your home and is in the recreational vehicle, and you can get to visit these parks that we have in this country. And none of my friends can really believe that this is a new obsession of mine. It's so off-brand for me, but I highly recommend, if folks can make it happen, to rent an RV, get on the road, visit some of our parks. It is tremendous fun. I mean, really, really cool.
What kind of mileage do you get on
Not great. Honestly, I think the best was 14 miles to the gallon, maybe 15.
So if your brand is about climate change, I think that would be off brand.
And interestingly, Our brand, so to speak, is a little bit. I mean, both of my husband and I are we're vegans and we compost, and I sold my car because I very much thought I didn't need one, and so we like to be conscious of that. But you raise a really good point that RVing is not environmentally friendly. Although, is it better than an airplane? I don't know. Probably not. But you'll have to forgive us on that front. It is great fun, though.
I'm sure it is, and this is the new segment where we're going to start shaming our guests for having particular interests. So, Jon, with that, tell us something interesting about yourself that we wouldn't know if we only knew you professionally.
I think the most interesting thing about me, and it's a very short list, is I first worked for Joe Biden in 1986, and I met my wife working on his presidential campaign in 1987. So my first computer password that I remember is Biden in 88. So I was wrong by about 30 years. But I met my wife on his campaign. I was her summer intern. She was my boss. But it worked out okay.
I just want to confirm, and you have changed your password since.
I have.
Yeah. Okay. It must have been, in some ways, though, a very interesting experience for you to watch now President Biden evolve over the 32 years between the two presidential runs.
Oh, absolutely. Right. So in 1988, he was the young guy running against, Walter Mondale. And, he was the new brash guy, the great public speaker, the guy who, the dig on him was he was a speech and nothing else and no substance. And now, or in the last election, the dig on him was he was the old guy and he was not a very good speaker. But, the great thing is he was, I really think the man for the moment, for what was going on in the country with the pandemic, and his empathy, and his life experience. So, I'm very proud of the work I did, 30 years ago, and that my wife did more of 30 years ago to help try and get him elected. We were dramatically unsuccessful in 1987, 1988. But good things come to those who wait.
All right. Well, let's go to our final segment that we are calling Free Advice.
And now it's time for the Curious Free Advice.
Okay. This is a new segment on our Curious Amalgam. This is the way it works. Alicia has identified a couple of places where people have asked for advice in real live advice columns. And what she's going to do is she's going to read each of you a question where somebody has asked for advice and then see how you, Yasmine or Jon, would advise. So Alicia, take it away.
Okay. Let's give the first question to Jon. Jon, this is from the Ask Your Mom Parenting Advice column by Dr. Emily Edlin on the website parents.com. Dear Dr. Emily, my teen loves soccer, but he's just not very good at it. I feel like a really bad mom saying that, but it's true. I am very supportive regardless, but he's mentioned that he wants to look at colleges strictly for their soccer teams, and I really don't think that's a good idea. How do I tell my son to branch out to other things without hurting his feelings?
I think self-awareness is really important, and children need some help with self-awareness. All children have to realize that they're not going to play in the NBA at some point, or they're not going to be ballerinas at some point. And I think encouraging kids to go in directions that excite them is fine. If my kids wanted to play a sport that they weren't really good at, I was happy to drive them and things like that. But there's a difference between playing basketball if you're not really good at it, or soccer if you're not really good at it, and being delusional and thinking you're going to go play it at the college level, let alone the professional level. So I would tell them the truth and also make sure they understand that there are other sports, right? Somebody out there needs to be a fencer. Somebody out there needs to do water polo. And there are opportunities in those kinds of sports too.
So are you saying you would actually tell your child he's being delusional?
I would say it more nicely than that. But I would, I'm a big fan of self-awareness.
That's great. Okay.
John, it was reminiscent of the conversation that you and I had when I told you I wanted to be a professional podcaster.
Aww.
Look how well it's worked out. I was wrong.
Yes.
Okay. Well, it turns out that question, was squarely in a field in which you've had extensive experience. Now, Yasmine, I don't know about this one, but this question is from the website thetakeout.com from the column Ask the Salty Waitress. Dear Salty Waitress, I hang out pretty regularly at a craft beer bar that offers free 1-ounce samples people can try before ordering a full pour. I'm pretty decisive, but I'll sometimes sample one beer before I order, especially if it's a flavor I'm not sure I'll like. But I see some people ask for 2, 3, even 4 samples before they order. The bartenders are super nice and patient and never seem to mind. But am I wrong thinking that's excessive? I feel like you get one sample before you decide. What's the line? Signed, not afraid of beer commitment.
What's the line? I feel like I'm going to have to side with the folks who, take advantage of the samples to get, to taste, to get an idea of what they prefer. I don't think there's anything wrong with asking for more than one taste. It's not like, what's your favorite color, red, blue, or green? I mean, I've learned that craft beers, they are pretty nuanced. There's all kinds of flavors that come through. And, if the bar is offering that as an incentive, why not take advantage of it? I can understand maybe giving a dirty look, here and again at someone who has 15 samples, but 2, 3, 4 doesn't really seem, I'm not offended by that.
Okay. And does the same rule apply in the ice cream store too?
Yeah, definitely. As long as you're getting a new spoon each time, let's just be clear. We don't want the taster spoons with people's saliva on them going in various, flavors. I think so. I mean, if folks are going to get mad about people asking for samples, you really don't offer it in the first place. Don't make people feel bad for taking advantage of something that you're offering.
Wow. Jon, Yasmine, thank you for your free advice.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Our Curious Amalgam, a competition, consumer protection, data protection, and privacy law podcast. It is produced and shared around the globe by ABA's Antitrust Law Section. The opinions expressed by the participants in this podcast are their own and do not necessarily represent their employer or other organizations. If you like what you heard or would like to become a member of the American Bar Association, please check out what the Antitrust section has to offer at ambar.org/antitrust. You can learn more about our podcast at ourcuriousamalgam.com. If you have comments, suggestions, or podcast ideas, please reach out to us at podcast@ourcuriousamalgam.com. Until next time, thank you for listening.